Kristen, good to see you. Happy New Year.
Morning cloud was bigger.
Yeah, because of the weather. 73 degrees.
Given the temperature, it's remarkable.
That's right.
Anybody.
I had planned on going home or going somewhere else between these panels, but I'm glad I did because if I got outside,
Okay, I think we're all ready to go. Appreciate everybody who's stuck with it today. A lot of interesting information, a lot of new ideas or reaffirmation of old ideas. We have a distinguished panel this afternoon, and we're going to do this, I was told, like a game show. This is a lightning round, so it's quick answers to a whole series of questions that we have for you. But to introduce the panel to you, to my left, Susan Dewey. She's the CEO of Virginia Housing Development Authority, and she's been in that role since 1999. It's now rebranded, and we'll ask her about that, as Virginia Housing. She's a longtime public servant at the state level in Richmond. She served as state treasurer from 1996 to 1999, and in that role she was on 16 different state boards and authorities. Fortunately, VHDA must have been one of them, and then transitioned from state treasurer to VHDA CEO. She's also served as president of the National Council of State Housing Agencies and as a member of the advisory board to the Federal Home Loan Bank of Atlanta. To her left is Arlington County Board member Christian Dorsey. He's been on the county board since 2015 and served as its chair last year. He also has this other responsibility called being member of the Metro Board of Directors. He's also vice chair of the COG board. In Arlington, he served on a number of nonprofit boards, and before joining the Arlington County Board, he was a senior leader of the Economic Policy Institute. It is now a policy and communications consultant in supporting progressive organizations in realizing their missions. To his left is Stan Slaughter. He's president and founder of the Paradigm Companies. His company has created over 10,000 residential units, probably almost in every jurisdiction in the Washington area. He has graciously volunteered his time to serve on housing affordability task forces in Alexandria, the District of Columbia, and Arlington. He somehow finds time to be president of the Board of Trustees of Lycoming College, where he graduated, and he has founded a DC charter school. I'd also say Stan was my first affordable housing finance instructor in the early 1990s when Arlington, AHC, and Paradigm came up with a very complicated plan to preserve and upgrade 500 apartment units in the Ballston area. I learned a lot from Stan then, and he also continues to remain advisor to the city when we need some clear thinking on development issues. To his left is Carl Moritz, who's the city's planning director. And as you could imagine or know, it's a very busy and controversial job with all sorts of development issues and opportunities that arise in the city. He's done an outstanding job in managing these and providing me and city council invaluable advice. And that included being part of the interjurisdictional team, the Arlington Alexandria Amazon team, and we now are, we'll probably talk a little bit about the impact of that and next steps. He's also served as the city as deputy planning director, and prior to that has worked as a planner in Maryland and for the Northern Virginia Regional Commission. To his left is Walter Webdale, who's the president and CEO of AHC. Walter started in that role in 1999 after spending 25 years as director of the Fairfax County Department of Housing and Community Development. Prior to Walter joining AHC, it was called the Arlington Housing Corporation, focused in one jurisdiction. It is now called AHC and is 8 jurisdictions, has developed 50 properties and has 7,500 units. Walter has also served as the president of the National Association of Local Housing Finance Agencies. At the very end is Mayor Justin Wilson. Mayor Wilson has been mayor since the beginning of 2019, been member of City Council for 9 years, and served as vice mayor from 2016 to 2019. He's a member and a new committee chair of the Northern Virginia Transportation Authority. He's prior chair of the Alexandria Transit Company, a member of the COG Board of Directors, and in his spare time, he's employed as a senior director for Amtrak. So we've got a lot of experience. I don't know how many units of development. It's probably with Susan and Stan and everybody up here and Walter, we have probably produced, 100,000, easily 100,000 plus units, or had our hands in some way, shape, or form on those in the region and in the state. So there's a lot of experience here, so we ought to get a lot of good answers to questions. I'll start with Susan. What does the new name Virginia Housing mean, and how does Governor Northam's new budget support that?
Well, we are still in the Code of Virginia, created back in 1972 as the Virginia Housing Development Authority. I think oftentimes people don't really understand what VHDA stands for, how we are created, and there's a lot of confusion. We deal a lot with the public as well as all the partners we have up here, so we thought just going to Virginia Housing would be a lot simpler and convey exactly what our mission is all about. And so that's what we're planning to do. And the Governor Northam's budget, I'm not sure it speaks exactly to that, but we are happy to partner with the Department of Housing and Community Development, who actually administers the Housing Trust Fund, and we're thrilled to see the additional money that the governor has put into the budget for the Housing Trust Fund and for some other things such as evictions. So we really do a lot to help them leverage that funding through our program. Virginia Housing was created, as I said, back in 1972 as an independent housing entity of the states. And so as such, we are fortunate that we're able to do what we do without any state taxpayer dollars. And that way we're able to, again, leverage what the state is doing through the budget bill.
Thank you. And I ask our two elected officials a question. Last year, the Arlington County Board and Alexandria City Council met in joint session. In that, you both talked about inclusive growth. What was the idea behind a joint proposal for an inclusive growth task force?
All right, thank you, Mr. Mayor. So everyone knows this. You have basically two ways in which business cycles operate. They're either in growth or they're either in contraction. In both cases, though, it are people who are most vulnerable who are most impacted, and usually negatively so. So in areas where you are contracting, you have vulnerable people who are the first fired or the most disproportionately affected by layoffs. They are the ones most impacted by a clenching of government services. And then conversely, when you have growth, those people are usually the last to benefit. So Mayor Wilson and I wanted to talk about a new model given the expected period of growth that was going to be coming to our region and to our respective jurisdictions most acutely, and trying to see what we could do together to ensure that we shifted that normal narrative, to see that growth actually be inclusive from the ground up so that people who are most in need of benefits from it can actually realize that from the outset. And that means as housing housing needs grow, that people are not subject to displacement right away, that there are opportunities for home ownership that they can benefit from, that there are jobs that are available for them to aspire to if they want to advance further or get an entree into sustainable middle-class careers. We kind of had this notion that if we thought about that with intentionality at the very beginning, we could actually shift the narrative.
Christian and I end up reading off the same sheet of music a lot here, so I'll try to say something distinctly different from what you did. I think if you look at any communities that are experiencing new investments or new economic growth, there is both negatives and positives that go along with this. I think nobody is really against economic growth. And you can't find folks who are against economic growth as a concept. But what they are against and where you see opposition is when there's a feeling that it's not going to benefit everyone, it's not going to accrue to the entire community, it's going to exacerbate disparities that already exist. And so I think to Christian's point, I think our goal was to figure out how do we chart a new model. Everyone's watching us. They are, the Amazon attraction effort was one that got a lot of attention in the press, both nationally and internationally. And now that it's coming here and there is going to be this growth, I think everyone's watching to see how this community deals with these investments. I think we feel like, and I think the word that Christian used is absolutely the word to use, it's how do we apply intentionality so that we can shape different results and ensure that we do not see some of the results that folks fear. And I think housing is one of the areas that when we got together, the two bodies, we prioritized because we feel like that's one of those base areas where if we deploy the right policy solutions, we can chart a different course and a course that benefits everyone in our community.
In following up on kind of the regional focus, you both participated as members of the COG board in establishing the COG's regional initiative that we heard about this morning, set ambitious goals. How are your jurisdictions supporting this regional housing initiative, and what have you seen around the region as far as housing initiatives post the adoption of these goals by COG?
Yeah, I'll start this one. One of the largest, as the city manager mentioned, our priority last year at the COG board was addressing housing. In many ways, COG in the past has been an area where we talk transportation is a big area of regional collaboration. And this is really an offshoot of that. As I said earlier this morning, good housing policy is good transportation policy. It's good economic growth policy. It's good climate policy. And I think the goal here was to recognize that supply, in the end, supply is a major part of how you address affordability. Everything else is important, but you have to have additional supply to address affordability. And I think that was the first recognition that all the jurisdictions of this region not only recognized that, but made commitments. Now we have to police ourselves. Now we have to hold ourselves accountable to creating that supply and ensuring that the supply is proximate to job centers, proximate to transit infrastructure, and is affordable to those who are most at need. And that was the goal. I think you've already seen how this has been kind of digested across the region, and there's been varying approaches, right? I know that there's been some press around how Montgomery County has, some disagreements at the elected level around what the appropriateness of these commitments and how to deploy them. I think the trick of this is going to be that how you build supply and where you build supply is going to necessarily vary across the region, and it should vary across the region. How we build supply in Alexandria and Arlington and Montgomery County and Prince George's County should be different than Fairfax County, Prince William, Loudoun, and others. And I think that's going to be the trick of this as we move forward, is making sure that we're smart about how we create additional supply and where we put it.
Yeah, I think absolutely. And, just to put a different perspective on the COG effort, the COG effort to me was really one of the more monumental things that our region has done recently, right up there with really coming together for securing metro funding long into the future, was this recognition that we needed a different approach to the housing market, that allowing each jurisdiction to operate locally was not really, meeting the fundamental market needs of housing in the metropolitan region. We built connectivity so that you can move from one jurisdiction to the next, but that wasn't really reflected in our housing policy, where we're each doing our own specific thing. And it was also caught up in these weird debates about whether or not housing, it's important to focus solely on subsidizing units for those who were most income constrained, or whether or not you had market-based approaches. And the answer, I think, that we came up with, it's both. And if you don't functionally deal with housing supply writ large, you're really going to be perpetuating structural unaffordability. So let's meet expected household growth with a commensurate growth in units. If DC wants to make that all about direct subsidy for low-income Washingtonians, that's a great thing. If other people want to look at other strategies, that's fine. But let's understand our own role in meeting a regional household growth target so that we can deal with these structural issues. I'll say in Arlington, we've titled our initiative Housing Arlington, and we are looking at just about everything. We're kind of taking an approach of we want to hear any and all ideas. Let us study what works for Arlington and what doesn't, but we're not going to close off anything out of hand. And that includes looking at areas of our county which have been historically devoted to one dwelling per lot zoning, wanting to look at different ways of utilizing those parcels which constitute a significant amount of land area in Arlington, probably in the city, certainly in the region. And whether it's accessory dwellings, whether it is duplexes, triplexes, other forms, other ways of thinking about it, we want to figure this out because for too long we have not had that comprehensive approach, and certainly for the first time we have regional people pulling in the same direction. So it's quite exciting from my perspective.
Stan, in talking about the region you've developed in multiple jurisdictions, how effective is inclusionary zoning in the jurisdictions that you've worked? Which jurisdiction do you think has the best policy and why?
Lightning round, right? We're going to do this quick. Let me say this. Inclusionary zoning, I understand as a developer the notion of having mixed income housing, of putting the affordable housing in the communities that are being developed, and I get the impulse to do that. Everyone in this room should understand it is the most expensive way to create affordable housing. In other words, the cost of an affordable unit in a high-rise, in a new project, it costs $250,000. If you bonus me the density, it costs $200,000 a unit. That's just the reality. And so wherever we're doing units, and we do units in all these jurisdictions, and lots of them do it, but wherever we're doing units, including Alexandria, that are included in a new project, that's the cost. And I can promise you, my friend on the left here, Walter, would take that $200,000 and he would probably do 3 units. He would take that money, he would leverage it with federal credits, he would rehab an older community or whatever else he would do. He would just produce a lot more affordable housing for the same housing dollar. So the point I would only make is that everybody just got to recognize that that's a choice. Embedded in inclusionary zoning is the notion that you're going about it in a very expensive sort of way. Having said that, it is mostly a cost borne by the landowner. And what I've said many times is obviously when you have an inclusionary zoning rule, you lower the value of the land. And so often, and DC is really approaching, they've passed the point where they have lowered the value of much of their land so that it will not go for housing. I was working on a site recently and it got put in this new section of inclusionary zoning that they're going to do, and the owner is going to go ahead and do self-storage. He's just not going to do housing at all because the value of the land encumbered by the inclusionary zoning lowered the value of the land sufficiently so that its highest and best use was something else. So Mark, the short answer is each of these jurisdictions are thinking about it and thinking about it in different ways. In my own view, the most exciting places, and we've had this conversation in Alexandria, for example, where the city council is at least open with the notion of an inclusionary zoning requirement providing a certain number of units, but open to the idea that if I work with a nonprofit or work with the city in another way and could locate those units off-site, owned by a nonprofit or something else, that they would be happy, especially if that would produce more affordable housing as an alternative. So in my view, the most exciting places we're working are the places that are thinking not about, I could whine like all developers do about we should be charged less and we should have lower levels and all the rest of that. But the reality is I think what everybody should expect is that whatever money is or whatever commitment is made to affordable housing, that we go about it in the most efficient way we can.
Yeah, can I just comment on that? Is this on?
Yeah.
Okay. Another factor that comes into this is with inclusionary zoning is there are income controls over those units. And so therefore, if I buy into it, can I build the wealth to take myself to the market? And when I come to sell, I find that I'm not in that position that I have enough to make a down payment or to afford a unit in a non-assisted development.
Walter, in developing around the region and in Baltimore, what are some of the different roles nonprofits can play than compared to the traditional role that, let's say, AHC has played in production of affordable housing?
Well, we have played just about every role in affordable housing. You mentioned first the Baltimore area, which is an entirely different area than in Northern Virginia or in the metropolitan area. There, most of our work has been with Section 8 type developments. We have, as we get into Montgomery County and also into Northern Virginia, we have dealt in very little Section 8, mostly in tax credit deals with Arlington and Fairfax County and Montgomery County. We've also got involved in a lot of mixed-use developments and mixed-income developments. They have proven, I will tell you, to be a bit of a trick, because all of a sudden, when you live in a world where you have waiting lists and you all of a sudden have a group of apartments that turn over at 40% a year, it's a different management perspective than you've ever had before in your life. And it took us a little learning to learn how to be an affordable housing manager and to be a market rate manager.
In talking about home ownership, Susan, I understand the HDA has a new initiative to increase minority home ownership. Talk about that a little bit.
Yes. This is an area I think probably of interest to a lot in this room. But, during the recession, there was a lot of losses in home ownership. And what we're seeing, though, is that gap widen with minority home ownership. And what we're trying to do is to look for partnerships with localities and nonprofits and others to try to determine what we can do. I think you have to be very intentional to come up with some new ideas and strategies that are really going to help minorities focus on home ownership. We have free home ownership education plans, and we have grants for counselors, but we're really trying to do more to address that gap, and we need partners to give us ideas on how to best move forward.
Carl, your department's going to be spending some time this year, more time,
right,
focusing on housing affordability issues. What are the kinds of initiatives and areas you'll be looking at?
Well, I think kind of like what Mr. Dorsey was saying, when you are faced with, as we are, with a crisis of this proportion, you really need to examine everything. And so that's really kind of our mission, is to say, we have to take a look at every part of the process and our plans and see what we can do to make them work better. It is a supply question, and it is, but it's also a production question. And so as we look at housing, we look at what our long-range plans call for. Where are we planning for additional housing? Where are there opportunities for a developer like Stan to actually add to the housing supply? Is our zoning ordinance crafted in a way that makes it easy or really difficult to produce those housing units that we have planned for? During when Stan or his colleagues come forward, is the process that we use to review those proposals predictable and relatively speedy? Because if it's not, maybe it is too risky for them to risk their capital to try to go through that approval process. So, and then finally, after the plan's gone through the hearing process and it's been approved, in the past, we've been seeing quite a few projects go all the way through the approval process, and then we would never hear about them again. And that's because there's a lot that happens after the approval in terms of getting financing, all kinds of issues that local government doesn't have control over, but we need to understand, and so that we can position ourselves to make sure that we're doing what we need to do to get that housing supply from theoretical to built. So our goal is to look at all of that, both in terms of where our plans call for housing and where there might be more opportunities to add density. The zoning ordinance, there's a lot of rules that we already know are inhibiting production of housing. Many infill sites already allow multifamily housing or townhouses, more than single family, and yet they're not being built. And there's a reason for that, whether it's setbacks, whether it's height, et cetera. So we need to examine those things. We want to talk about the approval process as well and see where it can be reasonably streamlined so that we're keeping what we need, community engagement, effective review, and still meet the timelines. And one of the things that I'm very grateful for, Mark, is your leadership in making sure that we have had the resources to try to keep the production pipeline timely and as unsurprising as possible.
Ask each of the panelists, what's the low-hanging fruit? Let's start on this end and work our way back. What are the things that we should just basically, Carl's talked about a few of them, just go out and in the short term, just go do and put in place, or take out of place if it's in the way.
I guess I would give a couple things. I think one of the things we all have to acknowledge is that obviously choices we make and choices we don't make all have consequences. Inaction is a policy choice in and of itself, and I think Carl talked on this, and I think Stan talked on this. We have a payload of policy decisions we've made over decades that are layered into our zoning code today, and they impact cost, they impact affordability, they impact the ability of viability of creating supply. And some of those probably were a good idea at the time, but whether they are a good idea today, a good idea in the face of some of the housing crisis that we are addressing, that's, I think, a question that we need to take on. We need to take on head on, and so I'm hopeful we will do that. The other kind of low-hanging fruit I would put out there is around conversions. We have we have a changing city, and land uses are changing throughout our city. And we have the ability to facilitate the conversions of obsolete land uses to potentially residential land uses that help address our supply issue. And right now, our policies and procedures in many ways are barriers to that, or certainly don't facilitate it. And so I'm hopeful that as we continue Carl's effort, which every week I add more things on that list, and I'm sure he appreciates that, but I think looking at our conversion policies and how we can facilitate those conversions is one of those low-hanging fruit ways that we can create additional supply.
Building on the idea of that we're looking for more supply, the big low-hanging fruit, as far as I'm concerned, is what I need is density and height. And the cost of real estate, especially here in Alexandria and Arlington, is such that I've just got to get more units on that property if I'm going to make the dollars work and make the development work. And that would seem relatively low-hanging fruit, that let's beef up what densities we allow. They can be well worked into neighborhoods. Arlington did it along the metro route. So you still have the single-family homes, the subdivisions, and then down the corridor are the high-rise buildings.
Just to echo the mayor just briefly, many of our mixed-use zones are relics of the late 80s, early 90s, or at least the thinking there, and many of them are structured to give preference to non-residential development. The idea was that non-residential development is a better fiscal impact. We need to give that preference, and so in many zones you get a higher density if you do non-residential than residential. There are additional setback and open space and parking and all kinds of requirements on the residential portion in mixed-use zones, and so I think that's a place we can look, as well as sites that are not in what we have traditionally called the growth corridor, which is within a quarter or half mile of a metro station, but they're well served by transit. They're near grocery stores and other things that allow people to do their daily lives without getting in a car. That may be opportunities for us to add density in the future.
Great. So I would say this, that the I mean, first of all, I agree with everything Walter said and height and density and all the rest of that stuff. If you really want to think of low-hanging fruit in the affordable housing world, and I hesitate to say this because lots of people in this room, we all understand that we have created a lot of affordable housing over many years. This is an area where inclusionary zoning perhaps worked better than the Section 42 program and some of these other ones. The Section 42 program, and that's the tax credit program, the federal program, really enables residents to qualify only once. If there's an affordable housing test the day they move in, they really don't have an affordable housing test again for that operator if it's 100% credit unit. In my view, this community spent a lot of resources to put that community of 100 affordable housing units in place, and as time passes, certainly those people qualified when they moved in, but when the firefighter married the other firefighter and they moved in together, they don't qualify anymore. And I know it's a very difficult social issue to say, boy, we're going to make them move. But they can afford an apartment, they can afford a market rate apartment, and that resource really is instantly available for somebody else who really needs an affordable housing unit who qualifies. And there really is a large number of those, and I think it takes real discipline, and that's why I'm making this here. It's mostly a political question. I say developers don't care. We get paid the same no matter who lives there. So it's really not a question of the operator. It's really more a question of policy. And if you really think about low-hanging fruit, there's a lot of those units in the city, in Arlington, and other places that really could be available affordable housing units if we dedicated ourselves to making those requalifications happen and dealing with sort of the social consequences of having to turn those units over. I know that's not very popular.
No, but necessary. If we always restricted ourselves to what we know is going to be popular, we'd be exactly where we are right now, and that is fighting uphill. And, for Arlington, I'd say, what among the things that we consider low-hanging fruit, as much as I'm committed to doing a robust study of how we utilize all of our land area, including the previously mentioned single-family zoning, I recognize that's not going to produce results in the near term. That is systemic, and that is a generational objective, but in the near term, we still have capacity on our heavy rail transit corridors through the use of density, bonus density. We're under capacity for what those areas can absorb. And I don't know if this is true in the city as much as it's true in Arlington County, but you've heard of Dillon's rule before. We're a Dillon's rule state, which essentially is based on the whole idea that local governments don't know what they're doing. And that is actually reflected in our zoning ordinance, where much of it is about what is impermissible for the county governing authority to permit. So it's organized in many ways, restricting our flexibility to look at unique proposals that may advance our larger policy goals. And in fact, we can't even consider what in many cases are very innovative, smart ideas that would work for our time. So looking at how to make our zoning ordinance more flexible is very much low-hanging fruit so that we can maximize sort of the latent capacity that already exists. And then, as much as we're renowned for what we've done on the Richmond Highway and the Roslyn-Boston corridors, we have other, heavily transit-oriented corridors, whether they be Columbia Pike or Lee Highway, where we still have vast amounts of potential for density and growth. And for me, just unlocking what we already have is the essence of low-hanging fruit, while we're also setting up our community to do the things that I mentioned long-term.
So when I think about low-hanging fruit, it's a challenge because most of us have been doing this work for decades. And I think we've picked off a lot of the fruit already. It's challenging, hard work, and it seems like the more that we do, the more need exists. But I will say one thing that I've noticed is that the conversation about affordable housing as a priority has really escalated. Governor Northam, when he announced his 11 priorities, One of them at the very top was affordable housing, and that's new because for most of the time I've been doing this 20 years, affordable housing has really not been at the top of the priorities for government policy. So that's exciting and prevents, I think, a lot more opportunities for us to all have these dialogues and to look at some new processes. One of the things we're very involved in is mixed income, mixed use. And that's very important, I think, so that we can deconcentrate income and make sure that there are more opportunities for people at lower incomes to take advantage of the opportunities that exist throughout their entire community. So we're really looking at some opportunities there and trying to look, I think you just said it, Christian, innovation is really important. We've got some great partners and they're looking at innovative ways to provide modular construction, to provide new financing tools, to provide new types of services that are needed. And so I think it's really all about, as we've seen here, collaboration and how we can work together and generate some new ideas.
Since you've indicated that maybe the low-hanging fruit's gone, maybe to flip it to further up the tree and ask each of the panelists, what's the big idea? What's the thing most worth going for, no matter whether it's low, middle, or high on the tree in a sense of difficulty to achieve?
Well, one of the things that Walter was saying, we really need supply. We just don't have enough supply when it comes to affordable housing, and whether that's home ownership or rental. But we also have to be able to preserve what we have. And particularly in this area with the high cost and, of course, concerns about the cost going even higher as Amazon locates in this region. So we've got to also preserve the housing that we have. And one of the things that we're doing at Virginia Housing is trying to get a better sense of the properties that might be at risk of going market rate so that we can do whatever we need to do to try to preserve that affordability.
So one of the maxims in Arlington is there were 25.8 square miles and we're not getting any bigger, which is not exactly true if you think big. And, much of what we believe here in the City of Alexandria and Arlington is the best way to move people and to accommodate growth is not through, growth in the ability to move in single occupancy vehicles, but it's to utilize transit. And if we think about a greater share of people moving through our region with transit in sustainable ways, what is currently devoted to right-of-way for single occupancy vehicles, we could actually repurpose as available land to provide opportunities for households to grow. And I know I'm thinking generational, this is multi-decades, this is big, it's not happening tomorrow, but that's what I see for our region, that we figure out how to solve one policy issue, how to move people more efficiently in an environmentally sustainable way, and think about the benefits of that. Very, very valuable real estate that can be devoted to making homes for people who are going to be a part of our region. So that's where I'm thinking, looking at maximizing what we can do with transit, moving people more efficiently, and figuring out how we can claw some of that back for housing.
Wow, that's great. That's the vision that we're looking for. And I think it's interesting. We're practical guys, so I can't be that visionary.
Welcome to the club.
But I would say this. I completely agreed with Christian's earlier point about the Dillon Rule and the restrictions that these jurisdictions, all of our jurisdictions have on really working collaborative with new ideas. I think there is a lot of smart people here, a lot of clever ways to do stuff, Carl and his team and so on, as we work our way through a particular project and a particular set of goals. And the notion that you really can come out with something that's a win-win and that the political authority in the area is the judge of that. They can make the judgment that this is a win-win and that can proceed. And back in when Mark mentioned back in the middle '90s, it was actually more like that than it is today. There was even a little more flexibility for how some things get done. But to me, the big picture would be a place where Absolutely, you have to have a base, and you have to have a level of expectations to the point. People have to know what they're going to get. They have to be able to make decisions based upon certainty. But if we've got a situation where a developer and a jurisdiction are thinking about how to be creative, there ought to be a way for that to happen within our system, which seems really hard to do, and that goes to that earlier point. And then the last thing I'd make is, and I tell everybody that the real solution to this affordable housing problem really is production. And we can say a lot of things, but we have to produce more housing to lower the cost. And sometimes the housing production seems like it's in conflict with the notion of creating affordable housing. We've got to produce a lot of housing, and that'll what ultimately will lower the cost.
Something that's come up a lot today is that theme of partnerships, definitely. And when we were just talking briefly about inclusionary zoning laws on this stage, it was occurring to me that, one of the challenges is that most of these requirements or these laws are not formulated or in a way that they trigger or allow the group of people involved to say, hey, wait, what if we did it a completely different way? Well, what if we had to do 10%, maybe we could do 20% if we just expanded our concept of who needs to be involved, what resources are available. Often that's because the time frames are so tight, et cetera, but we all know, as you were saying, that that $200,000 that went to one unit, if it's used as seed money for something else, could produce 10. And so part of our challenge is to make sure that our next set of rules and guidelines and frameworks are actually enabling that creativity to take place rather than inhibiting it.
I agree with Stan that production is the thing that we really, all of us have to keep our eye on, and that is the target that we have to score with. And the real problem with that, once again, is as you go up the tree, the one big thing you need is money. And there's a limited supply of the money. You can borrow it with the tax credits, you can borrow bond funds and so on. But where do you get that extra piece of capital that goes in the deal that makes the whole deal work, which is the gap that's there? Not only the gap in a traditional low-income housing tax credit deal, but in a mixed income development that you're being creative and being innovative. Nobody seems to want to supply that piece of capital. And if anybody has a source for it, see me after this.
So I'm going to say two things because I should never be allowed in lightning rounds. I want to touch first on kind of where Christian was earlier on this question around Dillon Rule and how it impacts the creation of affordability. Several hours ago when we were listening to one of the earlier presentations, it was a presenter that was presenting a bunch of different ideas for housing reforms, and one of my colleagues, who will remain nameless, asked if the Dillon Rule would allow us to do what was being proposed, and I said, absolutely. That's not a Dillon Rule. It wasn't a Dillon Rule restriction. But what we have to do as a result of the Dillon Rule and some of the restrictions that Richmond imposes on us on land use authority is we have to actually maintain our zoning at a naturally low level in order to preserve the city's authority over land use that occurs. Almost every single affordable housing project that we have approved, larger scale affordable housing project that we have approved, involves a rezoning. And it does that, it always has to involve a rezoning because we are changing the zoning to facilitate affordability because our normal status, our normal state of zoning doesn't allow that. And we are uncomfortable with providing that flexibility in the zoning code because Richmond limits our authority to regulate it if we loosened it up that much. And so I think that's where Richmond really plays a role in the authority that they give us locally. The other thing, kind of looking ahead, trying to be somewhat as visionary as Christian is, I think one of the issues we have to watch in the city, and this is actually an issue that I think we're a little bit alone on, I guess now coming up on 2 decades ago, there was a tragic high-rise fire actually in Richmond and cost a bunch of people their lives. And one of the legislators representing Richmond imposed some legislation that would require buildings to go back and add sprinklers, multifamily buildings to add sprinklers. And we were monitoring legislation as we do anything in Alexandria, and half of the multifamily buildings in the Commonwealth of Virginia that would have been impacted by this legislation were in the city of Alexandria. Alexandria, 15.5 square miles, half of the buildings. And it was because we did multifamily development in the city of Alexandria long before anybody else did. And so we were building these buildings in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And as a result, many of those buildings are coming up on the end of their usable life. And so there is I believe, a sleeper conversation for the Commonwealth, for the city over the next decade or so, that these buildings are going to come forward in a variety of different ways. They're either going to want to convert, they're going to want to rebuild, they're going to want to do a lot of different things, and that has a potential risk for our affordable housing stock. Some of those buildings are some of the market rate affordability that we have left in the city. And so I think we have to be proactive about working to preserve those, as well as working with those landowners, in the case that they are landowners of those buildings, to how to evolve those uses in the future. So,
thank you. That's maybe a good point, good place to end. We're out of time. We thank the panelists very, very much for your thoughts. And to close us out, the person who opened us up, Helen.
Thank you, Mark. And thanks to all of you for being here with us. You know, our country's having a Mr. Rogers moment. So I didn't have a red sweater, so I wore a red dress. And if I could sing, I'd sing this, but it's been so nice to be together with you today. And I appreciate the visionary talk, the innovation talk, sort of the tools we still need, the willingness to look at zoning, bonus density, it's all on the table. I think our city manager has done a very fine job running this lightning round. But for purely selfish reasons, I would say I hope you keep your day job. And so what I would like to do is to leave everyone, it's been a full day and lots of ideas. Please continue to help us think through what our next step should be. We're looking for where we can be impactful and what will it take and what are the next steps. So some of the ways you can do that immediately are to get on your phone and give us some comments to the questions there about what you think our priority should be and how we should get there, or do a Post-it note. We will be sending a survey to everyone who is here, and we'll be reporting back to our City Council and our Affordable Housing Advisory Committee to get their input. But clearly, the expectation of a day like today is to plot a new course, not only meet our housing master plan targets, not only finish implementing our tools, but also do our darndest to get to our regional housing targets as well. So thank you all for being here. We hope you will continue. We appreciate all the support you've given us, and we hope you'll continue to support us as we create housing for all in Alexandria. Thanks so much, and thanks to all of you.